welcome all of you in this event, which doesn't happen every year, but at least every 2 years when we have the O.Frederick Nolde Convocation on Human Rights. And my role is to be very brief, but to welcome the family and express our thanks to Nancy Nolde and the whole family for supporting this wonderful, wonderful course, the O.Frederick Nolde Ecumenical Seminar on Human Rights, and the convocation at which we always invite a speaker, and I'm about to introduce our speaker, and then the students who can get back report to you on what they have learned. And so as soon as our keynoter is finished, we're going to turn it over to Dustin Wright, who's the intern in this in this program, where he interned at St. Peter's in New York City, and then also was an intern in the Office of World Affairs. So in that way, the two are linked together, and he coordinates the UN immersion. That just gives you a brief description, of the course. And this is also an advertisement to the students to take the course this spring. My privilege to introduce the one whom Dr. Little, Nancy Nolde, has said for years, you've got to get Dr. Little here. Right, Nancy? And now, finally, the eschaton has arrived. So, born in St. Louis, Missouri, and he has graduated from a number of schools, the American School in Manila in the Philippines, Bachelor of Arts, College of Worcester, Ohio, Bachelor of Divinity, Union Theological Seminary, New York City, Doctor of Theology, Harvard University, studies in philosophy of law at the University of Frankfurt, and in ethics at the University of Marburg, and Doctor of Humane Letters, Elizabethtown College. He has been a fellow in any number of places, among them Harvard and Yale, and the University of Virginia. And he has taught at Harvard and at the University of Marburg, at Yale, at most recently the University of Virginia, right?
No, recently Harvard.
Most recently Harvard. Ooh, that's right. I have the order wrong. So he has taught in many places around the country and around the world. And so without much further ado, I'm going to mention three, and then one more, works that he's published. Religion and Nationalism in Iraq, A Comparative Perspective, Peacemakers in Action, Profiles of Religion in Conflict Resolution, and then soon to be published, right, forthcoming, Religion, Human Rights, and Public Policy, Cambridge University Press. Now the reason I added one is the only reason he's here, that's a joke, is because he wrote the preface to the book by John S. Mercer, For All Peoples and All Nations, the Ecumenical Church and Human Rights, forwarded by David Little. So I ask you to welcome Dr. David Little.
Thank you very much, President Cray. It's a great pleasure to be part of this broader program and course, of which I see myself as simply a part, and I'll look forward to hearing from the reports of the students involved in this continuing legacy of Fred Nolde. So I want to thank President Cray and the sponsoring committee for doing me the honor of inviting me to give this important lecture here at the Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia, where Fred Nolde, as you all know, from the 40s to the 60s, was an eminent professor and for a while graduate director. As I've become more and more acquainted with Fred Nolde's work, I've become quite impressed with the impact of his life and work on the church and on public life, both in the United States and abroad. And my estimation of his life and work has been enhanced very much by conversations I've had with Fred's wife, Nancy Nolde, and with his daughter, Freddie Nolde, and Freddie Berger, and her husband, Bruce Berger, who have become very close friends of my wife and me. We all live in the Washington, D.C. area together. I must also thank the indomitable but sadly indisposed Mark Staples for helping me in many ways, most importantly for arranging a lovely visit 3 or so weeks ago to this campus and opening the doors to the archives where I was able to take away, quite extraordinarily, a number of the files and materials that are contained therein. I also want to thank Kim Eric Williams, the librarian, I think he's here, for this extraordinary privilege to actually carry away with me for the time being some of that valuable material. This is a very propitious time for reconsidering the life and work of Fred Nolde. The reason is American historians and social scientists have recently displayed a strong interest in the post-World War II period when ecumenical Protestants like Fred Nolde were a dominant influence on American life, political and religious. During that period of the 50s, late 40s, 50s, which has become quite a serious focus for historical work, the ecumenicals were riding very high, and they were gradually displaced after the 60s by the American evangelicals. In the 1950s, roughly 30% of Americans thought of themselves as ecumenical Protestants, mainline liberal Protestants, and about 13% thought of themselves as evangelicals. After the 60s and 70s, those numbers have almost precisely reversed. And historians and social scientists properly want to know what caused that reversal and what was the impact of that reversal on American religious life and political life. And that's what I want to try to explore with you a little bit this morning. The ecumenicals in the post-World War II period were made up mainly of white, middle, and upper-class churches, Congregationalists, Episcopalians, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, Disciples of Christ. Until the late 60s and early 70s, business was good for them. Congregations were expanding, churches were being built, huge budgets existed for mission work and other forms of ecclesiastical outreach. Seminaries were bulging with eager, highly qualified, committed students, many of them dedicated to the parish ministry, either the conventional forms of parish ministry or unconventional forms such as inner-city parishes, which were very hot in the time. I was also part of that in the 50s when we all were in seminary. In characterizing the ecumenicals, as I'll call them, I will tend to speak of them as a fairly unified group, and that is up to a point correct. Still, there were differences among them, and I want to underline that point. Some leaders were Democrats, but others, like Fred Nolde, were moderate Republicans. They did not all see eye to eye on every theological, moral, and public policy issue. There were differences among them. Most important of all, the leaders and the local clergy and churchgoers were not always in full accord. The American leaders, like Nolde, and their counterparts in Europe and elsewhere, often moved out ahead of their congregants, especially when the disruptions of the 1960s set in. My impression is that immediately after World War II, when visions of a new world order were exciting, untested promises, there did exist something like a widespread common spirit among leaders and churchgoers, indicated by the enthusiastic reception of some millions of ecumenical pamphlets that were circulated during that time. But as the Cold War and the threat of communism materialized, along with the obstacles and frustrations that afflicted the United Nations and other international organizations, as those events unfolded, the spirit of unity within the ecumenical community really frayed a bit and lost some of its force. Even so, at least through the 50s, the leadership, including Fred Nolde, continued to exert significant influence, probably out of proportion to the manifest support that they received from the congregations. The congregations and leaders were already in a tenuous relationship, which would really blast apart when the 60s occurred. But ecumenicals, as their name implied, ecumenicals were devoted in the first place to overcoming divisions within the Christian church, to creating a new oikumene, a household of faith, that would include all liberal or mainline Protestants, as well as Orthodox communities, both in the United States and abroad. These groups would be brought together in the United States by means of the National Council of Churches, organized in 1950, and the World Council of Churches, with which Fred Nolde was so closely associated, organized, as you recall, in 1948. The new household did not include Roman Catholics because there was a good deal of mutual suspicion, both in America and abroad, between Protestants and Roman Catholics. By no means all. Fred Nolde was reaching out in a variety of ways to the Catholics, but not all ecumenicals shared that kind of spirit. It also, and this is very important, did not include the evangelicals, whose strength and sense of purpose, taking shape at the time, developed an explicit reaction to and resistance against most of what the ecumenical stood for. That's an important point. The evangelical church, which really was gathering momentum during the late 40s, 50s, was really founded in direct response, explicit response to the things that the ecumenical movement was representing. But the ecumenicals did not care only about church unity. They were also committed to finding common ground across religious divisions and to working with people from non-Christian faiths, perspectives, to create secular national and international bodies that they believed would help to heal the divisions that afflicted the world, including the United States. They had in mind divisions of all kinds: race, ethnicity, national identity, gender, political and economic life, and whether those divisions were national or international in character. They strongly favored post-war proposals for the United Nations laid out at Dumbarton Oaks, and for the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, whose plans were drawn up, you recall, at Bretton Woods. Not only did they favor these organizations, but they familiarized themselves with the details of Bretton Woods and Dumbarton Oaks, and acquainted themselves so well with these details that they became significant counselors, informal counselors, but counselors nevertheless to the US government and to other international governments who were engaged in the planning for these operations. Beginning in 1942, they organized widely publicized action committees led by notables like John Foster Dulles, an active Presbyterian layman, and eventually, of course, Secretary of State in the Eisenhower administration, and Reinhold Niebuhr, the famous ecumenical Protestant theologian. These committees enunciated the conditions of a just and durable peace, recommendations that were taken very seriously, I may say, by the Roosevelt and Truman administrations. Beyond that, ecumenicals, and particularly the leaders, were indefatigable organization builders. They helped create and became active in secular political organizations like Americans for Democratic Action, and of course the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs, the CCIA, which was directed by Fred Nolde from 1946 until 1968. In that connection, these people, these ecumenicals like Fred Nolde, were what I would call incorrigible policy wonks. They were impatient with high-sounding generalities and sought to take action and achieve results. As regards theology, ethics, and social policy, ecumenicals were centrists. Please bear that in mind. They distanced themselves from the left, namely the American social gospel, which had commanded considerable American Protestant allegiance from the 1870s, really, until the 1920s. At the same time, they opposed the right, from their point of view, which was composed of two groups: the realists, who believed, especially in international affairs, in divorcing morality from political activity, and argued, as many of you are aware, that vital national interests are the most important guide to foreign policy. The fundamentalists, or the evangelicals, were also part of that right-wing group opposed by the ecumenicals, and they, like the realists, were suspicious of all efforts to impose what they regarded as artificial and ineffective moral and legal norms on the behavior of the states, especially, of course, on the behavior of the United States, because that would, in their view, curtail the otherwise messianic capabilities of the United States. The social gospel in which the ecumenicals had grown up eschewed biblical literalism and played down traditional doctrines about crucifixion and resurrection, along with associated ideas of sin, grace, and forgiveness, as well as any suggestion of a serious gap between the ways of God and the ways of human beings. Rather, for the social gospelers, God and humans were intimate, confident partners in the common task of building the kingdom, of reforming the world by permanently abolishing war and living nonviolently, by eliminating poverty and inequality in keeping with the ideals of democratic socialism, and enabling individuals and groups to just say no to ignorance and petty difference and simply start doing the right thing. Given the Great Depression and international fascism that together produced World War II, given communism and the resulting Cold War, given the growth of nationalism and violent forms of anti-colonialism that followed, ecumenicals found the social gospel naive and simplistic. They reopened their Bibles and took renewed inspiration from seemingly outmoded images like the cross and like doctrines of sin and grace, now, of course, freshly interpreted. The name of Reinhold Niebuhr naturally comes to mind in this context. Niebuhr's picture, and here we go, good, thanks, John. Niebuhr's picture appears on, can you hear me all right? On the cover of Time magazine. This was the 25th anniversary of Time magazine, and it's rather interesting that they would choose Reinhold Niebuhr to appear on the cover of this issue. But the picture itself, it seems to me, is so terribly interesting and really summarizes, in my view, what the ecumenical theologians were all about. Have a look at the picture. Here's Niebuhr, an expectant and perturbed expression on his face. He's under dark, forbidding clouds. Here, if you can make it out, is a wasteland. This is World War II, etc., the consequences of that time. And here off in the distance is a tiny little white cross providing illumination. I think in some ways that says it all. It's a brilliant picture in summarizing what Niebuhr and the ecumenicals generally were trying to say in response to the environment in which they found themselves. I think the message is basically this. Human beings live under a compelling, inescapable set of moral ideals, but they do that in a fallen world whose realities, the product of deeply entrenched and hard to remove conflicting interests, frustrate and pervert those ideals. They must be, in response to this condition, they must be neither idealists, social gospel, nor realists only, but they must be realistic idealists. They must walk a middle way, combine the two in some rather uneasy form in order to provide the guidance that the world as it is really needs. They needed a theology of the cross, the ecumenicals thought, to support this, as I say, uneasy, if clear-eyed position. In short, they joined Niebuhr in praying for the serenity to accept the things that cannot be changed, the courage to change things that can and should be changed, and above all, the wisdom to know the difference. That's the famous Serenity Prayer of Reinhold Niebuhr, and it summarizes very, very poignantly, I think, and thoughtfully, the heart of the message that these people were driving at. Mind you, as good centrists, ecumenicals did not altogether reject the social gospel. They are best described as chastened liberals, both politically and theologically. They retained a strong commitment to internationalism and to reducing violence by finding just and peaceful means for resolving conflict. But for them, the realists did have a point. In the fallen world in which we find ourselves, force is sometimes requisite in the name of achieving justice and peace. They also devoted themselves to the ideals of economic justice and equity in line with the goals of the social gospel, supported by a strong role for the central government in achieving those ideals. But for them, governmental as well as economic power must itself be checked and regulated, preferably by a carefully nurtured and vigilantly monitored constitutional democracy, with, above all, provisions for the robust protection of human rights. Lord Acton's enduring reminder that power corrupts in whatever form it takes was never far from their minds. It was, in fact, their abiding loyalty to certain social gospel ideals, however much those ideals needed reworking, that set ecumenicals against evangelicals on the right. I'm making the point that they're walking a middle way between the left and the right. As I mentioned, evangelicals first made their mark by systematically opposing the ecumenicals at every turn, and that was never clearer than in their opposition to the ideals of internationalism manifested in the World Council of Churches and in the United Nations. And they were very much opposed to the doubts that ecumenicals shared about the exceptionalness of the United States of America. The ecumenicals doubted again and again that America had this special, exceptional moral and religious quality. Reinhold Niebuhr, for example, constantly, prophetically cut the U.S. down to size by reminding it of its own pretensions and of its own self-righteousness. The evangelicals didn't care for that kind of critical, prophetic attack and developed a very strong oppositional view. The ecumenicals also were very much opposed to this emphasis on the role of the central government in social and economic reform. The same is true theologically. Despite efforts by ecumenicals a la Niebuhr to reinterpret traditional Christian symbols and doctrines in new ways, ways more appropriate with what they thought the real world was like, Evangelicals in the 40s and 50s rejected those interpretations and concluded that however much the ecumenicals were chastened liberals, they weren't chastened enough. The key point, and this is really central here, the key point emphasized by the new history of the ecumenical movement is that by the time the 60s arrived, the center could not hold. That means that the ecumenicals' attempt at a middle way, a way that ran between what they regarded as naivete and oversimplistic thinking on the left, and moral obscurantism and reaction on the other side, all of that began to quake and decline. The numbers and influence of the ecumenicals followed suit. What came as a result of that, and the whole story of the post-60s development in America, was the polarization, something that has lasted right up to the present. If you have doubts about that, have a look at this morning's newspaper. What that means is that highly religious people, many of the members of the fast-growing cohort of evangelicals, in greater and greater numbers became part of the Republican Party, strongly oriented toward evangelical social policies on abortion, gender relations, the role of the government in social and economic reform, foreign policy, and other matters, while highly secular people associated themselves with the Democratic Party and many of the policies traditionally identified with the left. The loss of the center that was maintained by the ecumenicals, both religiously and politically, was part of the general decline of the moderate middle that was really initiated in the 60s and 70s, and then followed in larger proportions thereafter. I'm sorry we don't have time to go into the details of this, but in discussion I'd be happy to talk about some of those political and religious details that are part of this story. There are several reasons why the center collapsed, but a very important one is the Vietnam War. Because of the failed Indochina policies of the Johnson administration, the constituencies, including many ecumenicals, who supported federally initiated civil rights and healthcare legislation and other centrist policies, abandoned the center and moved to the extremes, both left and right. And the growing resistance to such reforms and the role of the central government in promoting these reforms, that began to be resisted strongly in a lasting way by the evangelicals as a result of the collapse of the middle. In commenting on the collapse of the center, scholars of the new history make two other points I want to emphasize as we get ready to consider Fred Nolde's contribution. First, despite the decline in numbers, the ecumenicals did leave a legacy. Ecumenical leaders may have lost American Protestantism, writes one scholar, but they won the United States. That's said, I think, with considerable exaggeration, but there is a kernel of truth in it. He means that liberal values like freedom, equality, democracy, pluralism, free intellectual inquiry, very much promoted by the ecumenicals, found some traction in the 60s and after, and strongly affected subsequent reforms in race and gender relations, and especially gay rights, as well as in pluralizing, and this is awfully important, pluralizing higher education, and favoring anti-colonial and anti-apartheid policies overseas, even if so far economic and political divisions in our country obviously have not been transformed to the same degree. That's my point about partial, all right? Partial influence, but certainly not complete, if you follow me. That's the first argument. Ecumenicals did have a lasting and enduring impact upon American society. Second argument put forward by the new historians is interesting. They say that In working to overcome religious, racial, ethnic, national, gender, economic, and political divisions in the world, and by blithely assuming that the best justification and impulse for such reform lay in ecumenical theology, ecumenicals like Niebuhr and Nolde put themselves in a contradictory position. They propelled their followers into a world open on principle to a myriad of new secular and religious perspectives, but without anticipating that some of those very perspectives would double back and dismantle the assumptions of the ecumenicals. The very cosmopolitan world they favored worked to undermine the parochial beliefs and render them obsolete. That happened, say the scholars, because ecumenicals completely failed to understand how much they were a part and a product of a very special, quite temporary set of historical circumstances. The immediate post-war years were a rare period in American history when liberal Protestantism, reconstituted in its ecumenical form, happened to achieve huge, disproportionate influence in both church and public life. Its perspectives were, as one scholar says, entrapped in an epoch of Protestant cultural hegemony, an epoch ecumenicals themselves inadvertently helped to overturn. Okay, what about Fred Nolde? Nolde's place among the ecumenicals is best understood in relation to these two observations that I've just mentioned for you. Ecumenical Protestantism did help to advance liberal values in some enduring ways, and it did take positions that worked to undermine its own cultural hegemony, though there are some interesting twists in regard to this second observation that I don't think the scholars of the new history have quite taken account of, and it's my role to suggest those. Nolde opens his book, appropriately entitled The Churches and the Nations, published in 1970, 2 years before his death, by calling attention to, quote, Christian testimony for peace, justice, and freedom. Although Christians, he says, know the difference between spiritual peace, the kind that passeth understanding, and peace among the peoples and nations of the world, the two for Nolde are very much related, as they are also both related to the concerns for justice and freedom. By the liberty with which they have been set free, says Nolde, Christians must commit themselves to seek earthly peace, justice, and freedom for everyone, everywhere. The pursuit of peace is unquestionably a central theme of his book, as well as of the many pamphlets, speeches, reports that I worked through in the archive material that I filched from this place temporarily. Significantly, Nolde gives the title A New Christian Peace Movement to the chapter dealing with the creation and general purposes of the CCIA, which he directed, as I said, for 22 years, and which he saw, I think, as a vehicle for putting into practice the Christian search for, quote, earthly peace, justice, freedom for everyone in the world. Heading that organization was not easy. In the 60s, when everything began to fall apart for the ecumenicals, the CCIA was attacked for being, quote, too close to the US State Department, as well as too Anglo-American, and for not being, quote, female, teetotaling, and young enough. Another author claims that from the beginning, the organization had a hard time taking any concrete policy positions because of East-West divisions, and typically, quote, avoided grappling with the hard questions of just how peace could be achieved. In my judgment, these criticisms are too harsh. However imperfect and beleaguered, the CCIA achieved results that were on inspection rather impressive, especially given the political divisions that afflicted the World Council of Churches, not to mention the world at large. The CCIA frequently adopted controversial positions that were paid attention to, on matters of nuclear testing, nuclear disarmament, consideration of the admission of the People's Republic of China to the United Nations, in those days a very controversial, dicey proposition indeed. The internationalization of Jerusalem, still a very dicey proposition. It offered proposals, often quite unpopular in US circles, for making national and international markets more just and equitable. It devised an idea for an early form of UN peacekeeping that actually was adopted in Korea and elsewhere, and it contributed ideas concerning the terms of peace that finally were part of the Korean settlement in 1953. In particular, that initiative on Korea included a visit by Nolde to Korea in 1953, later commended by Secretary of State Dulles, conveying the sentiments of many Christians around the world to President Syngman Rhee of South Korea, himself, by the way, a very active Methodist layman, urging Rhee to forego his plans to invade the North as an attempt to unify Korea. That was successful. Whether Fred was the only cause is, of course, not being claimed, but he contributed, no doubt, to changing the environment in which the 53 period was being acted out. But the contribution of greatest importance, which has not been given nearly enough attention by the scholars of the new history, is the CCIA's, and particularly Nolde's, relentless effort to promote human rights as critical to the cause of peace. The story of that contribution is compellingly told in the definitive book by John S. Mercer, mentioned by President Cray, For All Peoples and Nations, The Ecumenical Church and Human Rights, a book that should be very familiar to all the people in this audience. Thanks to Mercer, there is no need for us now to recount in detail the remarkable accomplishments of Nolde and his Jewish and Catholic associates on May 2nd, 1945, at a meeting in San Francisco with members of the US delegation to the United Nations, where, as one governmental official attested, the place of human rights in the work of the United Nations was forever secured. Nor need we retell the story of Nolde's irrepressible and indispensable interventions in framing the final wording of Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which guaranteed eventually, as a matter of international law, freedom of conscience, religion, or belief to everyone, everywhere. No, the key point here to make is how perceptive, how prescient Nolde was in grasping so tenaciously the deep connection between human rights and peace, and with special acuity, the decisive role of religious freedom. Nolde's insights and contributions have been abundantly confirmed by something known in political science circles as the liberal peace. That is the thesis, supported by extensive empirical data, that the orderly and properly sequenced development of robust liberal political and economic institutions, including the protection of the rule of law and equal rights, is a critical condition of national and international peace. On the other hand, illiberal, ethnically exclusivist, religiously exclusivist regimes increase the probability of violence. Of special importance in this whole analysis is the role of religious freedom, Fred's, I think, primary love in all of these discussions. A recent book called The Price of Freedom Denied, Religious Persecution and Conflict in the 21st Century, provides, on the strength of a broad and rigorous survey, strong support for the liberal peace. It concludes, to the extent that governments and societies restrict religious freedoms, physical persecution and conflict increases. By the way, the liberal peace thesis holds only that robust liberal democracies do not go to war against each other. It admits they sometimes engage in violent conflict with illiberal democracies and authoritarian regimes. But still it predicts, a la Fred Nolde, that liberal democracy, robust, well-developed, etc., and national and international peace expand together. That's the critical thesis. And that, it seems to me, is very much confirmed by empirical research in this day and age. Critics, by the way, complain, and there are critics of the liberal peace, that in the first place, liberal peaceniks don't take account sufficiently of the role of religion in peacemaking. And secondly, and with real justification in my view, that the liberal peaceniks, if we can call them that, also ignore the detrimental effects of neoliberal economic policies and the consequent growth of economic and income inequality on the cause of peace. Suffice it to say, though, that Fred Nolde, as an advocate, an early advocate really of the liberal peace, could not be indicted on either one of those two charges. He emphasized the role of religion in peace over and over again, and he was constantly concerned with regulating the markets in a just and equitable way, such that inequality did not expand and so forth. That was a fundamental concern of the work of the CCIA. Nolde's distinctive contribution to assuring religious freedom as an international standard brings us in closing to the second observation of the scholars of the new history, namely that the ecumenicals held parochial views that were entrapped in their own cultural hegemony, and therefore they completely failed to understand the degree to which their commitments to reforming the world eventually rendered their own beliefs and their own influence obsolete. That's the second one, you recall. There is something to these claims, in my view. Ecumenicals were somewhat parochial and somewhat complacent in not recognizing, as they should have, how limited, contingent, and provisional were their views and status, both nationally and internationally. Frequently, they envisioned, with probably too much self-confidence, quote, a world in which political thought and action stemmed from theological reflection stimulated by the church as they understood it. In other words, a parochial view that the Christian church, as they regarded it, was the key to making peace, justice, and freedom around the world. They did hold that view. Nolde himself held that view, and it shows up again and again. They also assumed, I think, that ecumenicals, this was part of the complacency, perhaps, they assumed that ecumenicals would be around indefinitely as special spiritual and moral guides to the policymakers of the world. And they did move in and out of governmental circles with ease and familiarity. That's very obvious. Nolde himself did that. And that was probably born of a kind of cultural hegemony, which can't be denied. Most of the members of the first-term Eisenhower cabinet were Presbyterians, for heaven's sake. Moreover, it is true, as one author writes, that Reinhold Niebuhr, along with other ecumenicals, did attack relentlessly the assumptions of the secular world, arguing that only a sense of obedience to the God of the Bible, properly understood, could provide the kind of moral direction essential to a world of peace, freedom, and justice. The same author concludes that, ironically, Niebuhr, the great anti-secularist, inadvertently rendered his views obsolete by enabling the secularization of his own progeny. However, I believe, and this is my contribution, I believe these conclusions, while partly true, are not totally accurate. Nolde, for example, despite all that he said, was by no means as insensitive to what was going on around him as is implied. While he often did express himself in parochial terms, he occasionally deviated. He once remarked that even with the conversion of large numbers of new Christians, the world would not necessarily be a better place. Solving poverty, inequality, the arms race, violent conflict, etc., required a sophisticated knowledge of the world and how it works, along with a solemn respect for the complexities, frustrations, and unintended consequences of every effort at reform. He shared this perspective with other ecumenicals, including Niebuhr, as well as the belief, repeatedly stated, that the search for world peace and order requires finding common principles that, as he said, win acceptance from people of goodwill who are not Christians. But where the emphasis is clearest and where it serves to challenge the new history most sharply is in regard to Nolde's developing convictions about religious freedom as a human right. Nurser shows that contrary to those Protestants who advocated religious freedom in order to open the world to Christian conversion, Nolde believed that human rights needed a much broader basis than that offered by Protestant Christianity or even by some inclusive religious perspective. It demanded an explicitly secular foundation, a word, by the way, that he explicitly used, by which he evidently meant a common, religiously impartial moral space accessible to and obligatory upon all people. The space is secular, please note, in the sense of not privileging any one religion or set of religions in regard to protecting conscience, but of honoring the freedom of conscience of everyone, religious or not. At the same time, and this is equally important, Nolde's notion also decisively limited the secular space by making sure that religious convictions are equally respected and made room for. The point is, Nolde's proposal was radically anti-parochial. It explicitly favored an inclusive, cosmopolitan approach to human rights as central to the pursuit of freedom, justice, and peace. Simultaneously, it made room for the vigorous public expression of different religious convictions. To be sure, under a human rights understanding, all consciences are equally free. None should be given special priority, thereby putting on notice the kind of Protestant hegemony that undoubtedly existed in public education in the 40s and 50s in the United States of America. But he wanted to make room equally for views like those of ecumenicals. Ecumenicals like Reinhold Niebuhr, his idea of religious freedom was, of course, you equalize the playing field, but you thereby enable people equally to speak up on behalf of their own religious or non-religious views. Whether his, Nolde's, or Niebuhr's, or other views of the period are now completely obsolete, or can continue to say something to the more pluralistic world ecumenicals help to create, sometimes quite intentionally, I'm trying to say, remains to be seen. Well, let me conclude. As the scholars of the new history of the post-World War II ecumenical movement tell it, ecumenical Protestantism left a rather contradictory legacy. It advanced the development of a more pluralistic, equitable social order based on the ideals of equal liberty in respect to race, gender, national origin, class, religion, but it accomplished that result because of parochial theological beliefs that were tied to a privileged social position, a cultural hegemony it wasn't fully aware of, and that it inadvertently helped to undermine. However, a reconsideration of the contributions of Fred Nolde to ecumenical Protestantism raises a question or two about that account. It strongly confirms the progressive impact of the movement, namely Nolde's influential efforts in regard to the cause of human rights in general and religious freedom in particular as a crucial ingredient of what we now call the liberal peace. At the same time, it shows that ecumenicals like Nolde were not as blind to what was going on as is alleged. He did hold some parochial beliefs, which sometimes seemed to assume that ecumenical theology and institutions would go on singularly as an indispensable basis for achieving peace, freedom, and justice in the world. But he also, quite self-consciously, held other decidedly anti-parochial beliefs, such as his commitment to a secular foundation for human rights. That commitment welcomed equal liberty for everyone everywhere, believers and non-believers alike, but it did not surrender everything to the forces of secularization. Rather, it meant protecting the right of ecumenicals on an equal footing with everybody else, of course, to continue speaking up in public for a theology of the center. Whether after all that has happened to them, those ecumenicals who are left and who still respect their legacy can help to reclaim the lost center of American religious and political life remains, as I say, to be seen. Thank you very much indeed.
I was writing my notes down. Thank you all so much for coming here. Thank you, President Cray, students, faculty, and staff of the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia, and Dr. Little for an amazing presentation. I thought it really provided some really great historical perspective. And especially Nancy and the rest of the Nolde family for supporting and continuing the work of Professor Nolde. It's such an important legacy of ecumenical social justice work, and it's, I think, very much appreciated by our seminary community and by many other folks around the world as well. My name is Dustin Wright. I interned this past year at the Lutheran Office for World Community, as well as at St. Peter's Church in Midtown Manhattan. It was sort of an atypical Masters of Divinity internship year, but it was also probably the best year of my life. It was absolutely fantastic. And so I'll just make a couple brief notes about how what I was doing there, as well as what the work of that office has to do with how that relates to the work of Professor Nolde, as well as sort of a little bit in terms of your lecture. And then I'm going to turn it over to 3 students who participated in the Nolde seminar this past year. They're going to talk a little bit about their experiences, and then we'll kind of just have some closing remarks as sort of the advertisement portion of the convocation. So, just to start, I make babies cry all the time. I'm so sorry. I think one thing that really strongly came out of your lecture was that the ecumenicals were realistic idealists, that they were centrists. And I think that a major contribution of the Lutheran Office for World Community, as well as many of the other human rights faith-based organizations at the United Nations, a major contribution of them is that as sort of centrist followers of Christ, they are bridge builders. Bridge builders between a wide variety of types of folks and organizations. One of the times when this became really apparent to me was during one of my first weeks at the United Nations. We were sitting in a meeting with a representative from the Mexico mission to the UN, and he was talking to us about, please give me more information about food and hunger policy. Many of the UN missions have very small staff. They don't have experts. And us, as faith-based organizations, we have been able to, with really rich networks of folks on the ground, especially with people living in poverty that may not have as loud of a voice, have a lot of experience in hunger and justice issues. And so we were able to convey that information to folks at the Mexico consulate, and then they were able to carry that forward into some of their work at the UN. There's countless examples of that sort of thing. One of the main things I worked on was actually in the UN archives trying to find a map from 1948 that indicated where exactly there was a no man's land between the Israeli troops and the Jordanian troops at the time, in order to sort of help folks on the ground near the Augusta Victoria Hospital, which is run by the Lutheran World Federation, predominantly for Palestinians in East Jerusalem, or in order to sort of help a lot of different organizations make sure that a Israeli Defense Forces hospital wasn't built immediately adjacent to the Israeli Defense Forces War College was not built immediately adjacent to the hospital in order to sort of protect it. So conveying information from different groups, it's a lot different than sort of national level advocacy. It's not sort of just get all your folks out and to call into their senator or congressman. It's much more taking some information from over here and bringing it over here where it's absolutely necessary. And when you do that, you actually find out folks disagree a lot less than one would originally think once they're informed. Another major thing we worked on this past year was through a wider ecumenical coalition called Ecumenical Women, which is many of the more liberal or ecumenical faith-based groups at the UN, working on the Commission of the Status of Women, which happens every year. The theme of this past year's Commission on the Status of Women was ending violence against women, and all forms of violence against women and girls. That was the priority theme. One would think that that would sort of be an uncontroversial issue, but unfortunately, due to what some folks in the UN system entitle an unholy alliance, which is sort of conservative Muslim countries, the Holy See, and conservative evangelical groups from the United States, primarily concerned about sexual reproductive rights, they kind of cause problems for the work of the UN year after year. But we as Ecumenical Women were able to say, no, sort of that kind of more conservative view about women's rights is not the only one that's from a faith-based organization, and thus we were able to sort of, once again, take information from one place, put it in another place, and be able to provide a little bit of space for the delegates from each individual country to say, no, there's some other views out there, we're going to move forward. And we ended up having a really, really, really strong output from that Commission on the Status of Women that I think will really help folks, help women and girls really around the world. So, and I'll just touch on one more basis, and then we'll start introducing the other students. One thing that's really going on right now, it's probably the biggest thing happening at the UN outside of everything with the Security Council in Syria and so on and so forth, is the post-2015 development agenda. As some of you may, who here has heard of the Millennium Development Goals? That's pretty good. So in the year 2000, world leaders from around the world got together and they set up a what's really could be thought of as the world's greatest promise to itself, or humanity's greatest promise to the world. Eight goals and 21 quantifiable targets to reach by the year 2015. Now, many of us in the U.S. are sometimes pessimistic about the work of the UN, unfortunately. But the good news is that some of these goals have already been met, and others will be. For instance, we have cut in half the number of people living in extreme poverty around the world as defined by people living on $1.25 or less a day. That number from 1990 has already been cut in half. Wow. Who knew that? Anyone? Few folks. Amazing news, right? Another one is that we have risen up the number of children in primary schools. There is now a parity between girls and average parity between girls and boys going to primary school around the world. Amazing. Another one, we've made massive improvements, and we're probably going to reach the goal on getting folks access to malaria drugs and HIV/AIDS retroviral drugs as well. Amazing things can happen when the world works together, but once again, this information needs to be conveyed from one place to another, and that's part of the work of our office, and especially with the advent of social media and that sort of thing, we're starting to experiment with that and sort of getting the general population to know this information as well. So bridge building as centrist followers of Christ is some of the important work. So now, the UN is basically trying to figure out what's going to follow the Millennium Development Goals. They just had a big event at the opening of the GA this year, and I really highly encourage you to kind of look a little bit more into that. I should probably stop talking. I could tell you a lot more about it, but feel free to talk to me after the convocation if you want to know more about that. So, without further ado, there was a great Nolde seminar that happened this past year, and I really had the pleasure of working with three of the folks here and a few others from the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia. So I'm going to introduce them one at a time, and they're just going to kind of come up and give a brief presentation about what they experienced at the seminar. And then we'll kind of have some, if there's any questions or answers, we'll sort of kind of moderate that, and then we'll have some closing remarks. So first of all, I'm going to introduce to you all Carrie Hayes. She is in the Masters of Arts in Public Leadership program here at LTSP. She's in her second year, and she attended or took part in the Nolde seminar this past year.
Hi everyone. Like Dustin said, I am a Master of Arts in Public Leadership student, so as the only non-Masters of Divinity student in the seminar, I think that gave me a little bit of a different lens for interpretation. I found the seminar to be really enlightening for me in my future work and in my understanding of how faith relates to my future work. I think I learned a number of things over the course of the seminar and with our visits to the UN, but I think the overarching theme of all of that has to do with interconnectivity. So I visited the Commission on Social Development meeting at the UN, and when I went, I saw a lot of things. I saw an incredible amount of diversity. I saw people coming from all over the world to talk with each other about what it means to raise the level of social development in the international community. I saw tons of translations. I saw great excitement, but I also saw some things that tempered that excitement. I saw people sitting next to each other, talking to each other as if they were a million miles apart. I saw people using development buzzwords. I saw a little bit of disappointment in terms of where we are versus where we could be. And I saw just a little bit of a lack of connection with those development buzzwords and what was actually happening. So when I walked away with this feeling that I didn't quite want to acknowledge, because I wanted to have great hope. I wanted to say, I went to the Commission on Social Development and I saw things happening. And so there was a part of me that didn't really want to admit to myself a little bit of that disappointment. But when we went to our immersion experience at the Lutheran Office for World Community, that helped me to voice that disappointment in a way that made it less disappointing. It gave me some hope because I was able to come together with other people of faith and to say, yes, we're a little bit disappointed, but that doesn't mean we don't keep working. It gave me the freedom to say that, yes, it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming how much poverty is in the world. It's overwhelming how much violence there is in the world. It's overwhelming how much inequality there is in the world. But we can still respond. There are still so many things we can do. It gave me a greater understanding of all of the human rights as being mutually reinforcing. And it gave me hope to become proactive rather than reactive. As one of our speakers told us when we were there, when delegates come to the UN, they can check their nationality at the door a little bit, brush that part of their identity aside to come together to talk about certain topics. But as people of faith, we can't check our faith at the door. That's a deep part of who we are and how we work. And I think just throughout the course, I gained a greater appreciation for the all-encompassing importance of working to create and preserve global community through the pursuit of safeguarding human rights for all. So, thank you.
Thanks so much, Carrie. Next, I'm going to introduce to you Carl Ravi, who is a recent graduate of the Masters of Divinity program. He graduated this past year from LTSP, and yeah, please come on up.
Thank you very much, Dustin. I am indeed Carl Ravi, a 2013 graduate of the MDiv program with a concentration in metro and urban ministry, and I am honored to be among those who were able to come back and speak today. A quick question, how many first-year students do we have in this room? Got a few of you. All right. Well, some time ago, actually not all that long ago, I was where you are now. I was a first-year student. And during my first year, a certain professor said something to me that stuck with me. She said to always keep your eyes open for examples in this world of trouble and of grace. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. She meant it, obviously, to be geared toward preparation of sermons. But you'll find when you start looking at the world with that lens on, trouble and grace starts popping up all over the place. I'm going to tell you about one such example. It was a cold, rainy February day. Coincidentally, it was the same exact day that Pope Benedict announced his resignation from the papacy effective the end of that month. Rather important day for public theology, eh? But more to the point, it was that same day that Carrie and I were set to attend the Commission on Social Development. And the particular topic being discussed that day was reporting on the progress made toward fulfilling goals about 3 targeted groups of people, those being the young, the elderly, and those with chronic disabling conditions. Now, based on what I've come to understand, as far as UN meetings go, it went very well. But there was only one minor problem in all this. Those 3 groups that were being talked about did not actually have a voice. Seniors and those with disabling conditions, apparent ones anyway, were not even in the room. There were some young people there, yes, that day, but they didn't actually talk to us. They read to us. And they read very carefully crafted statements that obviously had been written quite a while in advance of that commission. And you could tell that they had not written them because they were loaded with 5, 6, and 7-syllable words that teenagers just don't use, no matter what language they speak. So where were these people? Where were the young? Where were the elderly? Where were the disabled on that day? Where were their voices? Where were the things that they had experienced? Where were their hopes and their triumphs and their concerns? Where was the progress that they actually knew and that they had actually experienced? I don't know. All I do know is that it wasn't given a voice. And it's become evident not only through the course of this seminar, but through this excellent lecture that we heard this morning, that Fred Nolde saw that too. And so did the rest of the Nolde family. But on the other hand, thank God that they had the perspicacity to recognize that this didn't have to continue, that there could be another way forward. Thank God for that they had a vision of a different kind of world, and it was that vision that sent us to the UN and now outward into the various places where we have been sent. They had a vision of a different kind of world, a world where those in power actually recognize that it is their calling to be of service to those in need, and where the church is right there alongside with them as a voice of God's grace and blessing with those and for those in pain and in sorrow. It was that vision that Fred Nolde had, and it was that vision that sent all of us to the UN. So, Mrs. Nolde, to you and to the rest of your family who are here, I want to take the moment to say thank you. Thank you for having that vision that sent us all out from here to the UN and into the real world with the knowledge that we have gained, the knowledge of how to be not only voices for the church, but voices in conversation with those in power and those without power, conversations that can happen even in the most unlikely of places. After all, it is in the darkest and the most unlikely of places, isn't it, that God shows up to make all things new. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl, for speaking so eloquently on that, and really really kind of sharing your experience with us. Our final student that we have here is Rosemary Doucette. She also graduated from LTSP this past year in the Master's in Divinity program. And yeah, please come on up.
Good afternoon. I'd like to speak about, I went to attend the Commission on Women, but before that I'd like to go back and talk about the seminar itself. It's a year-long course, and the fall semester we have different speakers each week to help prepare us for our UN trips. These were incredible speakers. They weren't people who just read a little book and then came and talked for us. We had John Nunes, the president of Lutheran World Relief, Linda Harkey from the Lutheran Immigration Service. We had some of our own professors, Dr. Katie Day, and that's exciting to have someone who's your professor in a classroom and then come and do a special seminar. You see another aspect of them. Dr. Ronalini Sebastian also spoke to us. So each week we had a different speaker, just incredible people with stories to share. My experience at the UN was incredible. I attended the Commission on the Status of Women, and I was totally unprepared for this. I'm older than some of the younger students here, and I've lived a lot in a lot of places. I've had a lot of experiences, but you're never quite ready for what God has in store for you. And I expected to hear speakers talking about AIDS or domestic violence and rape, and I heard the most incredible stories besides those issues. And some of them are really specific to certain cultures and ethnicities. But then I thought, there's a reason why God has drawn us all here, and what can I take away from this? And I just want to share one story quickly because it's so different from my experience, but to show you how we can use our experiences in our own ministries. One of the speakers was a woman named Jane from Kenya, and she's albino. And lovely person, and she had told me, she said, "Can I call you sister?" And I said, "Sure." She said, "Because I don't really have a mom." She said, "So I'd like to be your sister." I said, "Sure." And then her story came out. Because she's an albino, in her particular culture, these people are viewed as pathological, that there's something wrong with them. She was disowned by her family. She was raised by her grandmother, thank God, but disowned by her family because it was as if they had sinned or something, and that's why they had this child who looked different from everyone else. So her ministry is to reach out and take care of these kids who now live on the streets, a lot of them abandoned by their families. And there's also a group that's exploited because some of them are told that if they donate blood, their blood will be used to save people from AIDS. So you have people who are marginalized by their society, and then they're told another story. And then, of course, the people who buy this, thinking that that's going to cure their AIDS, they're not cured either. So she's taking all of this together and started a ministry of education, a ministry of care for these children who are abandoned in the streets. And so I've become her mother sister, and we keep in touch on email. And I thought, now what can I take back to my own ministry? And I thought of the LGBTQ community, how a lot of children are being thrown out of their families. They're bullied by other kids. And so we can take every example that we've learned in this course and apply it to our own context. So the things that that I've taken away from this course is an incredible amount of hope that came from all the different speakers. There is a lot of injustice and ugliness and violence in the world, but there's so much beauty, there's so much faith. I saw and heard these women give up and give their testimonies. crying and just anguish by sharing their stories. But it's through telling their stories, their own stories, not someone else's, as Carl mentioned, but telling their own stories, that combined with their faith has brought them to a place of forgiveness and to a place of transformation. So I implore you to take this seminar if you can, because you will just be filled with hope in the face of all the ugliness that's going on in the world. You'll get examples of how to use the stories you're going to hear in your own ministry, whether you're going into ordained ministry or social services of some kind. And we see God's promises coming true in the faces and in the hearts of those people who are going to share with you. Again, I'd like to thank Ms. Nolde and the family for making this possible for our students. And not just our students, but as we leave here and take what we've learned and share through sharing the gospel throughout the whole world. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Rosemary, for, I think, really speaking a whole lot more eloquently than I ever could about sort of that bridge building and sort of those connections that can be made through some of the faith-based offices at the UN. I think it was really eloquently stated, and Jane's a really awesome person. And if you want to be connected with her, I'm sure Rosemary or myself or a few other folks could probably connect you further. First of all, I don't know when this is supposed to end, and how are we doing on time?
We're going to be adjourning for lunch over there, so
We're pretty much done.
we're pretty much.
All right, I'm just going to say a quick closing remark then, and maybe we can have some kind of one-on-one questions. I know a lot of folks probably do have questions afterwards. It seems like this spring, it's a spring-long or a semester-long course rather than a full-year course, the Nolde seminar. So I'm sure the format's slightly different. But once again, I really do encourage you all to take part in it. So there's lectures here at the seminary, and then there's 2 trips to the UN. One is to sort of, as a group, to go and hear a kind of a 3-day series of lectures. We have folks from both UN agencies like UN AIDS and UNICEF and that sort of thing. We have folks from some of the mission states. I believe we had someone from the occupied Palestinian territories speak to us this past year. And then there's also folks from some of the faith-based organizations that come to speak with us, as well as some more secular organizations that come to speak with us. This past year we had a new thing too, in order to kind of really try to carry on the ecumenical and even sometimes interfaith spirit of Professor Nolde. We had a lunch for just casual kind of unorganized conversation with many of the folks in the different faith-based offices, Protestant offices as well as some Catholic folks. Even I think there was actually a Baha'i person there as well. So it's a really, really great seminar. The other opportunity you have to go to the UN is for one of these specific commissions or events. So the Commission on the Status and Women, the Commission on Social Development. There's one student attended a forum on indigenous issues. So that's sort of the general format. But once again, I know we're running out of time, but if folks have any one-on-one questions afterwards, I'd be happy to answer them. I'm sure Carrie and Rosemary could stick around for maybe a few minutes as well. So once again, thank you all so much. I really appreciate, we had a really good showing today for Convocation. And especially I would like to thank Dr. Little once again for a great presentation, as well as Nancy and the rest of the Nolde family for once again continuing to support such an important body of work that Professor Nolde did, and carrying that forward, perhaps into a new generation of ecumenical workers that have maybe won't kind of or that will learn from their predecessors and kind of and move it forward. So once again, thank you all so much, and have a great day.